Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee once again, and it's Election 2020. This is the first of our election series, and boy is this an important time for both the world and for New Zealand. Every day as we get closer to the elections, New Zealand faces greater challenges. We are in a world of change, but not necessarily to the better. Into this mix, we welcome David Seymour, leader of the ACT Party. And to be fair, coming into this interview at the back of the strongest launch we've seen in decades in New Zealand, a record crowd on Sunday, and a new platform for growth in New Zealand. So welcome once again, David, to Business at the Speed of Coffee. So you must be feeling pretty good. So let's talk about the policies that ACT has rolled out. How do they affect business?
Well, I think first of all, let's just start with a basic acknowledgement that if people don't set up businesses, set up a nexus of capital, employees and ideas and customers, and create a product or service that customers want to buy at a price they can afford, nothing happens. Yeah. So that's the starting acknowledgement. And as I said in our last show, you know, my personal background, the way I grew up and the way my family did business, I've always had an appreciation of that. Number one issue is tax. If you don't have efficient government expenditure, then you're not going to have a competitive business environment. And right now, we have to acknowledge we're the highest tax jurisdiction on the Pacific Rim. And that's not any particular tax rate, that's government tax divided by GDP. We are higher than Australia, Canada, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, the US, all of them.
So a question of competitiveness, obviously.
We just got to have an honest conversation about debt. And this is, it's going to become very relevant. I mean, the government has just borrowed 140 billion. That means we take total public debt to 200 billion by the end of 2024. That is about $200,000 of public debt for a family of five.
$200,000 for a family of the average of a household.
Public debt, yep. And interest rates presumably will return to normal at some point because ultimately the price that people want for investing money is going to be fairly constant over time, no matter what monetary policy does, and which is crazy right now. Treasury's long-term fiscal strategy forecast, we're going to spend more on interest on that debt than on education. And you can see why young people are starting to worry about it. So, getting a fiscal track that says, okay, we got to run the ruler over wasteful spending, because that's ultimately tax and it's ultimately a drag on business. So can we afford $1 billion a year in KiwiSaver subsidies? I would say that's crazy. The Debt Management Office at Treasury goes to the international market, borrows $1 billion. Why? So they can give it to New Zealanders to play the share market. Total central and local government expenditure in New Zealand last year was 37% of GDP. It'll be different now because GDP has changed in government. Well, that's a crazy time. Singapore was 17% of GDP. Now you flip that around and look at it from a business point of view. If you succeed in Singapore, you keep 83%. If you succeed in New Zealand, you keep 63%. When people say, why does investment and innovation and exciting stuff go to Singapore instead of New Zealand? Well, one of the reasons is that if you do it there, you get to keep.
It's more rewarding.
Yeah, an extra 30% of your reward. So,
and there's the old saw. New Zealand's an easy place to start a business. I keep saying easy to start a business, hard place to make any money.
Yeah.
But it always seems to me that you don't have to go too far down the track whether you hit local government or central government. The red tape becomes an issue. What have you got in mind to do something about that?
So you've got to go right to the heart of the problem. One of my criticisms of the current government is no problem definition. So Kiwi Build, the problem was a lack of sections. Government builders on the same sections weren't going to make anything cheaper. Light rail to the airport, they still can't decide if that's actually the purpose or it's a urban intensification project. So problem definition is key. And when it comes to regulation, it goes back to incentives on politicians. So every time something crazy happens, the easy calculus for a politician is go on the radio and say there ought to be a law. And that's what happens every single time. There's no question of what problem are we trying to solve, what laws are already in place that maybe weren't enforced.
Use the ones
what are the costs? What are the costs and benefits? And this is where I go back to the firearm thing. A lot of people see that as being a fringe issue. actually the way the government responded in its regulatory capacity to the Christchurch shootings is a classic example of poorly done regulation.
So you don't disagree that we needed to do something about the guns?
No, absolutely.
That's something that people think, guns, and no, you actually believe we need to do something about the guns.
Look, here's the basic issue. A foreign national from Australia gets off the plane, moves to Dunedin. He's a single male living alone who's been to all sorts of interesting places on his travel history, like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the Balkans and North Korea. And then he gets his firearm license. No one actually interviewed him. And then he buys 2 AR-15s, which shouldn't have been available on the A category, but they've been recategorised by court decisions over the years. And then the police sign a form that allows him to mail order 3,000 rounds of ammunition. And nobody was saying, gee,
this is interesting.
Someone should talk to that guy. And if someone had, we wouldn't have had those 51 people dead. But the government hasn't. I think that's my basic summary of what the Royal Commission report's going to say. The government's legislated twice without even waiting for the Royal Commission report.
The public were baying for something.
Yeah, okay.
So there was a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah. But here's the question: what's the purpose of government as regulator? Is it to satisfy the political baying on a week-to-week basis, or is it to create a regulatory environment that solves the real conflicts, and there is a need for regulation between people, and allows us to get on with life efficiently, or is it to be a political
But what about the gangs with all their machine guns in the Bay of Plenty? And that's getting worse as we went the other day.
Yeah, well, exactly, and nothing the government's done has just solved any of that.
They more shooting recently.
They didn't hand in their firearms in the buyback. In fact, they openly defied the government, saying they wouldn't. So that's beside the point. But I just...
Well, the buybacks kept honest people honest, basically.
Yeah.
It hasn't dealt with the dishonest
Good people are still good.
Yeah.
But look, I just go back to how we should do it. We're in favour of a regulatory constitution. So if you look at our policy there, it's that we say we want to put in law the simple idea that if you don't like the way the government's gone about regulating, if they didn't ask and answer sufficiently the basic questions, what problem we're trying to solve, do the benefits of the regulation exceed the cost, does it impair private property rights, and does it unfairly restrain trade? If they can't ask and answer those questions and sign a declaration, then you can go to court and get a declaration that they didn't properly undertake the lawmaking process.
So that's a beefed up regulatory impact.
Yeah, it's put.
The regulatory impact reports don't seem to be done anyway.
Well, I know, and what I want to do is create a dynamic where the courts have a quasi-constitutional role, and here's the political calculus. So it's always easier to go in and just regulate when things get tough. But do you want to be the minister who's had 3 declarations that you can't follow the basic rules of lawmaking in this parliamentary term? Do you want the opposition getting up saying, look, it's the crook who's been done 3 times by the judges for making laws improperly? That's the kind of political dynamic I want to create, as opposed to what we have now, where the government just said, we're not going to do regulatory impact analysis for our first 100 days. I don't know what the logic there is, but they made some pretty stupid laws. And now they said no regulatory impact analysis for the COVID period. So actually they get rid of it when it most matters.
Let's keep going with your policies as far as business is concerned. The business community is concerned about infrastructure.
Yep.
And there isn't anyone walking upright that doesn't think we need to get house prices under control.
Yep.
Now, if you look at without being too tough on Labor, the fact is those two things really haven't. No. There's been something happening in the regions, but nothing's really changed, and it would appear for me that there was a lot of enthusiasm for it, but they didn't do the regulatory heavy lifting that needed to happen to make it happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Mr. Twyford's Kiwi Bill just didn't work, because they didn't enable it to happen. Well, what are you going to do about it? Well,
first of all, here's how big the problem is. I just look at Sleepyhead. I mean, they've given up on Auckland City.
Moving south.
That Auckland City is so bad at providing infrastructure and housing, they've basically decided to create a parallel society in the middle of a field in the Waikato, because they think they can do a better job than Auckland Council, whose job it is. So it's a huge problem, and every business and every wage bill is a whole lot of money going into our inflated housing market, and that's a huge problem. So what do? Number one is you identify you've got an infrastructure problem. Our policy is to say if a the house is sold, a new house in your council's jurisdiction, half the GST on that goes to the council. Now that does two things. One is it acknowledges councils actually don't have enough revenue and rates to provide the infrastructure they need to provide. But second of all, it changes their incentives.
It's kind of like this New South Wales stamp duty in a way.
Yep.
Because it's kind of transaction tax.
Yep. Well, I'd put it differently, because remember that the GST is already being charged on a new sale. We're just changing.
But it's money you're not going to lose because you haven't got it already anyway.
Yeah. We're just changing who is going to. Yeah. Well, exactly. If it leads to more building, more GST, it could be revenue neutral for the Crown. But from the council's point of view, they're getting a huge amount of money. I mean, half GST is 7.5%.
Yeah.
You know, if there's a $500,000 house, that's almost 40 grand. Now, you think councils are going to start wanting to consent?
Do you think the central government's going to be happy to give that up? I mean, that's one of the problems, the tension between the central government and...
Right now, one of the fastest growing costs on the government balance sheet is trying to purchase housing in a supply-constrained market. Now, they're paying all these people to stay in hotels. So in the long term, I think the Crown's got to do something about this. So number one, change the infrastructure form, give the councils some money. But also, if you're the council CEO sitting there, you're thinking, geez, if we want to balance our books, we've got to consent some more houses because we get some revenue off it. Number two, the RMA is completely out of date, and we have to replace it with an Urban Development Act. I would take the work of the Productivity Commission, their Better Urban Planning Report, and I'd put that in place for cities over 100,000 people. RMA and the rest of the country, separate topic. Finally, I'd say, why on earth are councils engaged in quality assurance for new builds? If you got on a Boeing and it said that the inspection had been done by the local Evergreen County Council, you'd say, get me off this thing. And the point is that in the aircraft industry, they do quality assurance for their building, but it's all private. And they're a private quality assurance company.
Well, their insurers insist on it because they're not going to get insurance unless...
Of course. And we're saying use the same system for housing. There's already private QA companies in construction in New Zealand.
Well, I've argued for years, inspecting... anyone that knows anything about manufacturing, which I do, you can't inspect quality it has to be in the system itself.
Yeah.
And so you audit the system, and you could do that easily. And I'd have thought the insurers would insist on it.
Yeah, so our policy is mandatory private insurance. People will work it out. But here's the thing, when you had long and illustrious career in manufacturing, did you ever think maybe the council should come and check out?
Well, I know my neighbour built a house. He said there were 38 different inspections in building this house. And huge delays, of course. And it's expensive and inefficient.
Well, and it's pernicious because the councils are worried that under JSL, joint several liability, they're the last man standing. So they get more and more engaged in trying to micromanage the construction. But the more engaged they get, the more liable they are. So then they think, geez, we better get more engaged. And it's just a disaster. So
have you sensed there is a groundswell of understanding of this as you've talked?
It's one of the toughest issues there are. And the simple reason is that there's not many commodities where 60% of the population are a would-be vendor. So I think a lot of people understand it really well. Whether they want to is another issue. But I just know for the future of New Zealand, if we want this to continue being a place that people come for opportunity, then the average person, just a cop married to a nurse, say, need to be able to have a realistic stake of having a place of their own in the biggest city, and that's becoming less and less realistic.
It's affecting the schools. They can't get teachers anywhere. They can't afford to live in Auckland. And also Queenstown and Wellington. They've got similar problems. So
massive. One of the biggest issues that principals in the Epsom electorate talk to me about is they say, look, on a starting teacher's salary, you either can't afford the rent to have no commute, or you can't afford the commute if you're going to rent.
But we also know that the market, you can let the market do the work. Christchurch, after the earthquake, they built a lot of houses, and guess what's happened? The house prices have stabilised. They're still not cheap, but they've stabilised because they increased the supply of them. So
absolutely, but remember, when people say the market, the government's got a monopoly on the infrastructure. And the government's got a regulatory role, and the council's got a QA role. So unless you're prepared to, it's funny. It's a little bit like after World War II, because the Germans had no government left. They were prepared to let a lot of stuff happen. Well, it was a little bit like that after Christchurch. There was a bit of an open season, and we saw what's possible.
So let's talk about why we're not attracting the rights of the capital into New Zealand.
Okay, so like if you look at our 5-point plan or alternative budget we released in May, so a lot of it's about balancing the books, and we talked about some of the expenditure. A lot of it's about regulation. We talked about the regulatory constitution. But it's also about things like foreign direct investment. You know, we say if you're originating from an OECD country and you're not a security threat, you should be able to invest in New Zealand. You know, people say that Canadian pension plans are some sort of threat to New Zealand. I mean, believe me, I lived in Canada. I'll tell you something about Canadian pensioners. The only group that cannabis consumption rose for after legalisation was the over 65s.
Really?
Yeah, you can see the ads for the Ryman Village, you know. So the Canadian pensioners are not a threat. We should let them invest here, you know. As long as it's not security sensitive or not buying military hardware or something, they should be able to invest. And we do that for the whole of the OECD. They're all democracies. There are other countries I think we should be worried about, but not the OECD.
And of course they're the ones that are most interested in investing.
Exactly. I mean, there's more Canadians, Americans, Australians, Swiss and Brits.
Germans?
Yeah, look, we love Germans. You know, they should be able to invest here.
Well, I've always argued that not all investment dollars are the same. I mean, somebody buying into a lines company isn't the same as somebody building a factory in South Auckland.
Yep.
And yet it seems to be that people that have invested from overseas tended to buy the annuities, the easy soft options, which tends to price them off the market for local people. And what we really want is people in a productive enterprise. So what is there in your policy platform that might make it attractive for people to invest in productive enterprise in New Zealand?
Well, first of all, I mean, ultimately, you know, the government can't just get good investors, but what it can do is get out of the way
What about
of
the
people who
Overseas
want to
Investment
invest.
Office?
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, we would effectively exempt OECD originating investments from the OIA, with the exception of national security concerns. So I'm worried about getting capital into New Zealand. So, you know, our 5-point plan says exempts OECD originating investments from the OIA with the exception of national security concerns. None of this economic benefit, all this crap that they go through that just is so deadly to progress. I think there's also a huge opportunity. You know, I'm quite optimistic about being an island nation on a pandemic planet. We got choices that continental countries simply don't have.
I think we need to get our fence up stronger because there are people are looking down here and saying, "Oh, that's a nice place to come."
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you know, but it's also got to be a smarter fence, because I just give the example of the City Rail link. So I did a site visit the other day, and I said, "Well, how are you going to get people?" Because you know, most tunnelling engineers aren't in New Zealand because they only build one tunnel every century, so you know they don't stick around. You think how over time and over budget rail projects go normally. If they can't get those European tunnelling engineers into New Zealand,
Suddenly got worse.
Yeah, they're going to be much worse. And right now, we can only process 240 people
And
a
it's
day.
mainly New Zealanders. that are
Well,
coming
yeah,
home.
and it's
and they're not
the first priority. Well, yeah, exactly. And the first priority is people with New Zealand passports.
Many of them are actually criminals, unfortunately.
Well, and the criminals are getting in ahead. So you know, we got to think about how we have a smarter fence, and a smarter fence is one where we say, look, you can actually, for instance, if you're a hotel, here are the regulations for operating a private quarantine, and here's the penalties, and here's the inspection regime, which is going to be tough because we're going to stay safe. But if people want to pay, why shouldn't they?
Yeah.
And airlines could start working out packages with hotels. You know, fly to New Zealand.
There's some people who will have
2 weeks
to pay.
stay. Well, if you're building a tunnel under Auckland, you might have to.
Yeah.
But right now, that option's not there. So, but look, I'm optimistic we can get that right. If you're prepared to do that, then there's huge opportunity. And I would say something like GE, for instance. You know, we have this medieval superstitious approach.
Yeah, well, we've outsourced that to local councils.
Yeah, well, look.
And these are all experts on science, aren't they?
Well, I don't know. If you didn't laugh, you'd cry. I know what you mean. But we got to update, you know, our genetically modified organisms legislation.
Well, the problem is there's been a lot of misinformation.
Yep.
Like, it's kind of like the fruitcakes involved in anti-vax and all the anti-science, and they're quite vocal and they repeat myths and so on. And unfortunately, the scientists aren't that articulate in trying to demyth it. But the G one is, I mean, there's a whole generation that I know of very smart young scientists that are not here.
Yep.
Because they just can't do their work.
We push them away. And,
Yeah.
and I'd say the same thing around fintech regulations.
Yeah.
We've actually made it hard with some of our silly laws to have a fintech industry. So, you know, some of this modern weightless economy stuff that you know, people say, well, why don't we have more of it? Well, in some cases, it's not actually difficult. We just need to stop repelling them. Yeah. So look, I think there's opportunities there, but ultimately, look, you know, there's no silver bullet. It's about tax. You know, how much do you lose if you succeed? Regulation. How many options are closed off by well-meaning, politically motivated regulation that actually stop possibility? And where's just a little bit of positivity and creativity around, you know, how we can have smart borders to reopen.
Well, that'll make a difference. Now, David, up until very recently, you'd have to say that you've been a lonely voice in a one-man band. So how are we going to turn this into an orchestra? You've got a team there. Tell us about the team you've put together.
Look, we got a really high-quality team. So if you look at Brooke van Velden, she's 27.
Very articulate young woman.
So was Richard Tribble when he entered Parliament. And people say, oh, are these people well known? No one knew who Margaret Thatcher was till she got elected and changed the world. I look at the talent of them. So Brooke has been incredibly effective on the End of Life Choice Act. I employed her out of the private sector to get that done, and she got it done. Now she's going to be a really good MP. Nicole McKee, you know, was the spokesperson for the Council of Licensed Firearm Owners. People like to pigeonhole her that way. The way I look at her is that she was asked to do that job, and she was awarded Communicator of the Year in very tense and difficult times. She succeeded. If you look at the welfare policy that she released on the weekend, I think that really showed us how
and she's got the backstory to support it, of course.
Well, her own family has had some sole parent support, shall we say, experiences. You look at Chris Bailey, you know, so he's a cop, a youth aid officer for 14 years, high school teacher.
Deep thinker.
Yep, special needs students. But he also runs a pub called The Honest Lawyer, which he's been doing for you know, a few years now, and he employs 30 people, so he actually knows a bit about making an honest buck. We look at Simon Court, he's a reformed greenie. Now I look at the diversity in our top four. We've got 2 Maori, 1 South Islander, and a vegetarian. 2 of our top 5.
And a farmer and some gumboots.
2 of our top 5 have confessed to voting for the Green Party before. Simon's one of them. He was a hippie. He watched what happened in '89, travelled to Europe, and he noticed that it was an environmental disaster. Now he's been a civil engineer. He's worked in Europe, he's worked in Fiji, he's worked in really dangerous places such as Auckland Council, you know, he's basically come to the conclusion that if you care about the planet, it's not a question of regulating more, it's a question of innovating more. Often the regulations we have stop the innovation. So that's that blue-green, I guess, panacea that people have been looking for. We've got the real deal.
David, you know, one of the difficulties is, you know, trying to get elected. You know, what do people care about? And often people care about their wallets, they care about what happens in the neighbourhood and so on. But it seems to me, as we go into this elections, it would be a good idea for the electorate to think about their instincts. What I'm hearing from you, your instincts, let's park the detail of policy, is more individual self-responsibility, is that right? More take charge of things, a more positive view of the future, allowing for people's enterprise to escape. Is that we're sort of...
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely true. The question really is, are we going to run on let's keep moving, which is the Labour Party's view, might as well be followed by nothing to see here. It's a collective vision. You don't have your own identity, you're part of the team of 5 million, that's who you get to be.
It seems to me with Labour, you're going to get people making the decisions for you more. So if your instincts is to let somebody else take care of everything, that they know more about your life than you do, then...
And don't question, let's keep moving.
But a lot of your difficulties will be taken care of, maybe.
Maybe,
But we heard from your team about the shortcomings of social welfare, for instance. And there's a whole nother story there.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the Labour the people that we had, for instance, Karen, who's our number 7 candidate, she is a SIFS kid, and she can tell you how the system really looks after the most vulnerable, and you could hear a pin drop in that theatre when she told her story.
It was deeply moving, I have to say.
So, you know, she can tell you what the reality of the education and welfare and child, youth and family systems, and it's not pretty. Our alternative, our slogan, in contrast to Labor, is change your future. So you can question. People can make a difference in their own lives. It is future focused.
What about
totally
the right
different
to
message.
offend? I mean, this is a big people toppling statues around the place. Where do you come out on all that? And now there's a big debate, of course, how we regulate social media. To what extent do we deal with this?
Look, I think one of the biggest challenges we face as a society today is not, you know, welfare or health or education or productivity. I mean, those are all problems. But underlying all that is our declining ability to have a civil conversation and disagree civilly. And this is a huge difficulty. The government's role in it, of threatening to legislate hate speech laws over the top of what happens in civil society, I think is kind of secondary. The real issue is we got to work out how to get on as 5 million people without people being constantly attacked and marginalised for their identity before their argument's been heard.
Well, you've got to be able to hear the dissenting voice.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you know, that is a real concern. Will that, do you think, become a topic as the election gathers?
It's one of those topics that I think is under the surface, and it does influence people in a powerful way. I'll give you an example. We got Green voters who say, I can't believe it, but I'm a Green voter, I'm a Liberal. All my life I've believed that ultimately we should respect people's right to think their thoughts and share their views without intimidation. And I can't believe that the Green Party are now the primary thought police who go around on Twitter beating up people who disagree. They're coming over to ACT, which is a great shock to both us and them. But there is a value there that I just say to people, look, you know, Kate Shepherd, in my view, is the greatest New Zealander, and after Christian Cullen, she did it through her powerful oration. If you read some of her speeches, it was the ability to speak her mind that allowed her to succeed.
Yeah, well, as we come into this election, what is the implication now as you go into the next few days into the election?
I think ultimately the voters are not stupid, they're intuitive, and they know there's some issues that need to be resolved. How do we get smart on public health? How do we get in control of public debt? And how do we seize the opportunity of being an island nation on a pandemic planet? Those are the questions.
Regardless of whoever's leading the National Party, still stay there.
Those are the issues that matter, and they've got a number of capable people, and in combination with ACT, I think we can take the campaign to the government and give people a choice about how we go forward with those issues.
Well, I mean, you're in for an interesting period. I think probably ACT looks like it's on its way up. Do you want to predict the number of seats you're going to get in Parliament, or is that a bit early?
All I say is a lot of things are going to happen, but all the internal indicators for us are good. So, you know, I'm getting crowds of over 100 people showing up in suburban and rural bars every night. And, you know, last night people showed up, listened to my speech. We got $3,000 on the mobile EFTPOS machine, people saying, I want to help ACT. Can I give you some money? So, you know, if you do that every night, that's a lot of momentum. And I suspect that if that's indicative of the mood out there, then ACT could be the real surprise package of this election.
Well, David, wish you all the very best. Thank you for coming into Business at the Speed of Coffee. Election 2020, Business at the Speed of Coffee. Thank you, David Seymour.
Thank you, Kim.